Right, and I guess I should turn my camera on too. So, welcome to our brown bag on ngconf. Of course, that is on Angular. All of you knew that before we came in. Keeps giving me these pop-ups. Knock it off. All right. So Angular Conf this year was a little different. It's normally done here in Salt Lake City. And I had to change it up a little bit this year because no one was allowed to travel here to Salt Lake City. Pivoted really fast, actually. Got it put together, got everybody coordinated to present remotely. They actually did a really good job overall, I think, getting that converted over. Found a good platform so people could still interact a lot. Made lots of time for us to have to go through questions and have Q&A sessions with the speakers. I was going to try and play the theme song they wrote for it. I don't know if you guys can hear that at all. Is it sending the sound through as well?
I can't hear anything.
Okay. Well, I'll have to, I'll just put a link in the slides for those who want to hear it. We got to listen to that song several hours every day while they, in the background or as they switch stuff over. Is pretty catchy. So the idea was going to be a musical, and they've kind of moved all that back to next year. So next year, really interesting. So I went to a couple of days of workshops. They did all kinds of different stuff, all different levels. NGRX, testing on Cypress, some hands-on Jamstack stuff, which I'll get to later. Some architectural things, and then 3 days of speaking. All kinds of stuff, mostly about Angular, obviously, but they also covered many things that are just general design considerations. Version 9 of Angular, which is out. They went through Angular Universal, which is server-side things. Went through how Angular supports domain-driven design. A few one-off things, like a really good talk on AI and TensorFlow in the browser. The kid that presented that was 11, and I think he's smarter than I'm ever going to be. It was a little intimidating, honestly. So they got all kinds of stuff in there. It's a really good conference. And lots more stuff. So the talks eventually are going to go up on ngconf's YouTube channel for those that want to get into it and drill into the specifics of anything we mentioned. They also posted the speaker slides. It's a Google Docs spreadsheet, which nobody's going to type off of there. So there is a link in my slides. I'll share that on Slack later or whatever. So just one other note before I launch into stuff. I really liked how they were professional. They had some really amazing content. It was well prepared and presented. But they also weren't afraid to be themselves and acknowledge, yeah, we're doing a little bit of weird stuff this year. It's from home. You're all in your pajamas, whatever. Let's just have fun with it. One of the better talks was done entirely in the theme of Frozen. I was not expecting that. I'm not a huge Frozen fan. Nothing against it. I just don't have little princesses running all over the place in costumes and singing the songs, which is totally fine. But it was actually really good. He talked about how to freeze objects, which was, I think, where he got the excuse to do the entire thing this way. Went through how to author libraries, how to lock down certain parts of your API. It was actually really well done. Another one, the guy decided, hey, I'm going to present this as a magician. It's every bit as cheesy as it looks and sounds, and it was actually a really good talk on how to hide things, behind interfaces, how to use mocking for design stuff. And so he did a little back and forth with himself pre-recorded where he'd do a magic trick and then he'd come out and, explain how it was done. So really fun, kept it interesting, kept it light. So I was just going to run through some of the things that I learned. I just realized I should make this full screen so that doesn't mess it up. So well, it's obviously an Angular conference. They went through lots of design stuff. It wasn't just, hey, Angular, Angular, Angular. There was a good dose of that. The keynote and focus was obviously on Angular. They started off with Angular 9 and all the improvements they've made. I won't read that whole thing off to you, but they've improved, the library size. They've improved support for internationalization, different languages. Sometimes we get a little tired of all the updates that happen, of being on the treadmill of, there's another version out. Why do I need to update this again? But they keep getting easier to use. They keep making better architecture. Angular's kind of opinionated, and it's helping you do things the right way so that your project works well, not just your code. I think Micah is going to talk a little bit about some of the monorepo stuff and some of those things. But it just keeps getting better and better and more secure. And they've actually made it really easy to keep up to date and to bring your projects forward to the latest version of Angular. That last bullet there's a link to the Angular site, which has update paths and guides. It'll walk you through everything. So I think it's really good that they're supporting the community and supporting the projects and the style and the developer needs, and not just going, oh, well, our platform is fine and it's up to you how to use it. They really help us do the right thing. Some of the non-specific stuff that they talked about was a lot of domain-driven design, a lot of architectural decisions. There is support for that in Angular. Keep trying to decide whether they call it Ivy or version 9. I'll switch back and forth no doubt. But they've built more things into the framework to help you with your design and with coming up with appropriate models, using them properly, reminding you to do the right thing and not just the quick thing. There's some built-in support for making sure that your libraries are interacting properly. One thing I really liked was that you can set up a project type and say, this is a utility library, and then the framework will prevent you from referencing in UI classes or DOM components, and it makes sure that your separation of concerns stays appropriate, and that you're not linking things together that are going to make it harder down the road. They've also added a bunch of new debugging tools. They've added some hooks directly into the framework, so it now will show up inside your DOM and your dev tools. There's tools in there for unit tests, for reading those objects out. If you're using some other library like Cypress, you can directly reach into those components and see what Angular sees, and not just what ends up in the browser, which really is a much better experience than just hunting and pecking around and jumping back and forth between stuff. So it obviously doesn't get rid of the other dev tools, but it does complement them pretty well and helps you figure out what's going on and develop it properly. They also had some really good talks on other features that are, again, not Angular specific, but they are baked in so that you can use them a little more easily. One that I liked was learning about HTTP interceptors, which is something I've kind of been getting into on the side anyways. I've been doing some Jamstack stuff again. I'll talk about that in a second. But ways that you can centralize your network access, centralize your error handling, and separate the network issues from your components so that you're not constantly having to check response codes and deal with timeouts and things like that. You can kind of move that off into one spot. There's a couple of really good talks on design. There was I believe it was UX person is what they do professionally. I don't think it was a developer at all. They talked about some of the common UI patterns, of how going through your UI design first and laying out your interactions makes it much easier to build your components, much easier to leverage native tooling, make your apps accessible, make them compliant, which is becoming more and more important as companies get bigger and reach more places. Another talk that went through some functional programming things, higher order mapping, and had some really good hands-on demos of the observables in JavaScript, the different types, different ways to pipe them together and pass your data and modify it. So just really practical hands-on stuff. And then some other things like type checking your templates. Angular's got better support for that now so that your TypeScript models are more tightly enforced. reduces your errors, reduces your things you have to think about. And then I believe this is completely new in 9, and Micah, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but they've got some more preloading stuff baked into it where it handles eager loading, laser loading, handles the caching a little better. So you can, rather than having to think about that and decide, oh, I have to handle each image this way or each link this way, you can just kind of pick some defaults and go, hey, I want to preload stuff faster. If it's on mobile, throttle that back. And the framework just handles that for you, which is fantastic because that's hard to get right on your own. So that's a quick general overview. I was going to answer some questions on Jamstack if people had them. That was one of the things that I'm most interested in right now. So if you're not familiar with it, Jamstack stands for JavaScript, APIs, and Markup. It's pre-rendered stuff. So you can just deploy a static site. You don't have to have a live server running. You don't have to maintain, database connections and take the time and security models on those. It just, simplifies some of the things for you. The guy that talked about this was the author of Scully, which is a newer library that's very Angular centric. It's a Jam framework, I guess. And went through how they built it, some of the ways they used Angular, and then walked through deploying that on Netlify, which is a great hosting site, provides cloud services, so forth. And Scully isn't the only option out there. It's one of the newer ones, but there's lots of common ones like Gatsby, Higo, Nuxt. For anyone who's interested, there's some really good resources on this at those sites. Jamstack.org kind of goes through the philosophy, a few examples, the pros and cons, and then staticgen.com has a lot of really good examples where you can just spin up and run through each one. So here's the Jamstack site. It's got the best practices, the examples, the whys, and then staticgen. You can go through and pick out whatever language you want to work with. I'm primarily a C# guy, so there are a couple of options there. Since we're talking Angular, Scully is kind of the only main one that they've talked about right now. I'm sure there will be more. But just about any of these at this example, you can come in, look at it, see what it does and why. And then nearly all of them, you can link directly to Netlify and say, go ahead and launch this and spin up a site for me and start playing with it. It's really easy to get into. So some of the quick pros and cons of Jamstack. Since it is pre-rendered markup, there's no dynamic runtime. You don't have to be running Node or any kind of web server to serve it up. So that really cuts down on your hosting costs. It's pre-rendered, so it's fast. It's more secure. Nobody's going to hack your static files and, get anywhere with it. There's not really anything to attack. So it's a little more secure and just one less thing to worry about. It's really good for SEO because it's pre-rendered. The mobile search sites, they kind of try and parse your JavaScript to run your app, but they're not great at it yet. And so something that's pre-rendered is really good for SEO and performance scores. It does rely heavily on content delivery. So if you're not familiar with that, you've got to make sure you get your caching strategies right so that when you redeploy, you're not hitting stale data. But most of those frameworks have really good things built in for that. And then one thing that I hadn't thought about initially, since I don't do a lot of heavy content sites, is that most of them, your content ends up in your source control. So I've been practicing with Gatsby more. And so most of your content is markdown files. So they stay in your Git repository, they're controlled, they're managed, and then you interact with them through some sort of headless CRM that also checks stuff into your repository. So, as people are editing content, it manages that for you too. So it's a really good experience from both sides. So that's kind of a quick overview. Like I said, I may do a longer brown bag on that later at some point. I wanted to leave a little more time for Micah since I think he's going to have more in-depth stuff to cover. So does anybody have questions about Jamstack or about anything else I covered or about the conference? Bueller?
Nothing. Sounds like I'll take over then. Thanks, Brian.
All right, go ahead, Micah.
Yeah, let's get you turned on. There we go. All right. So yeah, like Brian was saying, since he did all the heavy lifting of talking about the conference as a whole and discussing basically all of the topics that were covered, I have the luxury of just focusing on kind of two aspects that interested me. So we can do a bit more of a deep dive. So it looks like it's pretty much all STG people here, but if there were a few others that I didn't recognize, yeah, my name's Micah Wood. I've been working with STG for 6 years, in their scripted practice. So the last 3 years, I think, maybe even 4 at this point, has been living in kind of the Angular space. So I've been, was there in the latter days of the Angular JS stuff, and then moved into some of the, then moved into Angular around version 2. And so this is my
That's
third
the best
year
drawing of you so far, Micah.
Yeah, I try to keep them up to date, though that shirt's not exactly this shirt, but it's just the top half, so that's all that matters. But yeah, so the third year, I think, at NGConf. But yeah, so kind of the main things that I wanted to go over specifically that stood out to me were NGRX and mono repos, kind of some of the updates in those spaces. So yeah, one thing that I liked about a lot of the talks at this year's conference was they were focused on kind of several popular libraries where they would give kind of an example of, or not example, but look back at how the projects have grown over the last year, and then get into what they're planning on developing over the coming year. And so it can kind of give you a lot of context of, what's happened if you weren't paying attention to them, and then kind of a reason to pay attention to them going forward. And so NGRX was one of those things where if you're not using them for state management, you're probably not paying a whole lot of attention to them. And so seeing what they're working towards was pretty exciting. So we'll get to that. So first of all, if you're not familiar with what NGRX is, this is kind of how they describe it on their own documentation. They kind of build themselves as a framework for building reactive applications in Angular, and it provides state management, isolation of side effects, entity collection management, router bindings, code generation, developer tools, basically things that will enhance the developer experience when you're building your applications. But if you ask somebody else what NGRX is, they'll most likely just say, oh yeah, isn't that just kind of Redux for Angular? And it kind of is, but it's kind of not. So you could say that it's like Redux. But if you picked up kind of by their own description, it's a lot more than just state management, where Redux is very specialized in that one space. NGRX has lots of additional features. So they do provide the state management with NGRX Store, and that's probably what most of you are familiar with if you've heard of them in the past. But they also have their own kind of side effect library with NGRX effects. So if any of you have worked with Redux, this is where like Redux sagas come in, or there's a whole bunch of others, but Saga is the only one that is coming to mind at the moment. They've got an entity collection management portion, which basically just makes it so that if you're following some kind of standard, you don't need to you don't need to write as much code because it can kind of generate a lot of the commonality between all of your different entities. They've got router bindings so that you can make the existing Angular router a bit more reactive and tie it into your state management as well. And then newly this year, they added NGRX data. And so what this is kind of like Entity. It's taking code generation to the extreme. So instead of needing to create a whole bunch of different actions and reducers and all of the boilerplate that these kind of state management systems are known for, it hides all of that away behind just a configuration file. So it assumes if you have like a post entity, then it assumes you're going to want kind of all of the CRUD actions, and it will have an endpoint that it uses when you want to update it to store that information on the database. So as long as everything follows kind of a standard convention, you can basically get away without having to write any actions or reducers and just let NGRX data handle it. And this actually started out as outside of the NGRX umbrella. It's just kind of an add-on that some other developers had made. And yeah, the team liked it so much that they brought it into their mono repo. And so now it's maintained by the same people working on all of NGRX and everything. But yeah, all of this was very much focused on state management. This is all kind of their, nothing outside of that realm. And this is all stuff that's currently there. But before we get into kind of the new stuff, I did want to take a bit of a detour because I'm guessing not all of you are using NGRX, but a lot of you are probably still dealing with some tricky state management. But you're not wanting to go to the extreme of having a Redux style store. So one of the talks that Dan Wallin gave was on another library called Observable Store. And it's a very stripped down state management library. So all of the heavy lifting is done by RxJS. And so, yeah, you're not needing to worry so much about a lot of the more like, I guess, academic kind of things about NGRX, like learning about actions and reducers and kind of how that whole thing flows. So Observable Store was kind of conceived with the following goals. So the first thing was they wanted to, or it was Dan Wallin's thing. So he wanted to keep it simple. And so the entire library is actually only about 200 lines long. A good portion of that is because it relies heavily on RxJS to do a lot of the heavy lifting. But if you use it in an Angular application, you've already got RxJS included. So there's no additional dependencies. But there's nothing in it that's Angular specific. So it can be used with other libraries like Vue, React, Svelte. Basically any JavaScript library can make use of it. But it does copy a lot of the benefits of a more complex state management system. So it does have the single source of truth for state. State is immutable, so you do need to update it through what essentially boil down to actions, but a bit more abstracted from you. And then, yeah, people can subscribe to the state to get notifications when things are updated so that your applications can be reactive when you use it. It does track state change history, so you could have things like an undo functionality natively built in. And then, yeah, kind of sticking to the keep it simple mantra. It's easy to understand. The documentation is nowhere near as lengthy as some of the more complex stores are. And like I'd said, it works with any front-end project built with JavaScript or TypeScript. And then one thing that's really nice is it does integrate with the Redux dev tools. So if you've ever used those in the past, it's just a really nice dev tool that will show you what your state looks like. and show you all of the actions that have been dispatched so you can see how your state changes over time, making it really nice to kind of track down bugs and things like that. So if you're at all interested with getting Observable Store a try, you can check it out on its GitHub link. And Dan Wallin also provided a blog post on kind of the process of what led to it and what the goal of the library is. So now that that detour is out of the way, we can kind of head back to NGRX. And so, yeah, like I kind of alluded to before that aside, what interested me the most about the future of NGRX was less their state management and more with some of the initiatives that they're kind of playing around with outside of that area. So there were two features specifically that they got into during the conference. The first one was NGRX Component, which deals more with observables and a lot of the kind of templating issues that you may have run into when using observables in your templates. And then NGRX Router, which is a pretty dramatic change of pace from how the existing Angular router is structured. But they did talk about how this is very much the bleeding edge of development. NGRX Router hasn't even been officially published yet. So yeah, these are all highly subject to change, but they've at least got some working concepts going. So we'll start with NGRX Component. This one does exist. It's in an alpha or a beta, but yeah, you can pull it down from this package. And so kind of the main goal they had with starting NGRX Component was rethinking how change detection works in Angular. So if you're not as familiar with change detection, basically it's the way that Angular determines that something in your application has changed, and then it figures out what needs to update in the DOM to reflect those changes. And so the way that Angular's handled that currently is with a tool called Zone.js. And so the way that works is it actually monkey patches all of the async APIs that the browser uses. So if you use something like a set timeout or an HTTP call or any of that asynchronous functionality, Zone.js has mutated it in a way that that it can know when those things happen and when they've completed, so that Angular can then check to see if state of your application has changed, and then start re-rendering components as needed so that the UI reflects the latest data. So this has the benefit of it's super easy to it almost seems like magic from a developer perspective, where all you need to do is change the property on a component and it immediately updates in the view. You don't need to use things. You're not needing to call methods to tell Angular that the state has changed. It just somehow knew that the state changed. So yeah, from that perspective, it works great. It does have some drawbacks though, because Zone.js needs to have patched all of these various APIs. If there's newer functionality that Zone.js hasn't updated, then Angular change detection is going to be completely unaware of it. So one example would be if you tried to use async await anywhere in your code, Zone.js doesn't know how to handle that, so that's going to break change detection. I believe WebSockets aren't currently supported either, so you'd have to manually trigger change detection in systems like that as well. And so, yeah, a lot of strengths, but some drawbacks, especially if you're wanting to use some of the latest and greatest features. And so NGRX Component, is kind of wondering if we can have observables be the trigger mechanism for change detection, because if the observables are storing the state of your application, then they know when things changed. So the first thing we'll look at is a drop-in replacement for the async pipe. And so if you're not familiar with this approach, the async pipe just makes it really easy to subscribe to an observable in your template. It handles automatically unsubscribing when the component is destroyed. So it handles some of the, what's the word? Some of the boilerplate, I guess, of working with observables. But it doesn't do anything with change detection or anything like that. It just displays the new information that observable emits. So yeah, as I'd said, they were coming up with drop-in replacements for some of these common things. So you can just replace the async pipe with their NGRX push pipe. And so you get all of the exact same functionality you did before. It's going to, as new authors get emitted, it will update your template accordingly. But the benefit here is that by using observables to maintain your state and relying on the push pipe to trigger your change detection, you could potentially run your applications without the use of Zone.js. So that would make your application smaller. It could actually make them more efficient because change detection is a bit more naive. And so Angular provides optimizations to improve the performance if you've got a larger application with hundreds of components that are updating regularly. That's where you get into like the on-push strategy for change detection. But the hope is that by getting rid of Zone.js and having something a little bit more tailor-made for your application and its specific needs, that it would improve performance. The next one that they brought up was addressing kind of a similar problem. And so another thing that you'll probably run into if you work a lot with using the async pipe is you need to access multiple properties from a single observable. So in this case, you wanted to get the name, profession, and bio of an item from an observable stream. And so, yeah, one possible way is you'd have kind of this clunky repeating the async pipe again and again. Angular developers did come up with a workaround where if you just wrap it in an ngIf, you can use this as syntax to kind of get a nice workaround where, yeah, now you're just referring to it as an author, so you're not needing to use multiple async pipes. Works great unless one of the values that could come through your observable is a falsy value, like null, undefined, false, an empty string. At that point, your ngIf would actually trigger an else template if you had it, or it becomes a bit harder to maintain. Also, if your observable errors or completes, there's no way to handle that specifically from the async pipe. And so they came up with instead of a new pipe, this is a structural directive called ngrx let. And so it looks kind of similar to the syntax of the ngIf, but the benefit is it works with falsy values. It works with everything because it's not doing an actual if check. There's no conditional rendering. All it's doing is unpacking your observable and letting you work with the values as needed. And like I said, it has some other functionality to handle error and complete events as well if you needed to handle those differently in your template. And just like the push pipe, it also triggers change detection. So yeah, if you just made use of those two pipes entirely, you could start experimenting with removing Zone.js from your application. The other NGRX thing I wanted to discuss was the NGRX router. And like I said, this one isn't officially published under NGRX yet. It's in the developer's kind of personal repo as he experiments with it. And so their router has some goals as well. If you're not familiar, the new Angular renderer Ivy kind of changes the ways that components are registered and rendered, and a lot of how Angular used to handle things are becoming less and less of a requirement going forward. So, for example, one of the things that the future of Angular may look like is optional ng modules. So it may look similar to more of a React application where components can have their own, they'd have kind of their own injectors, their own state, their own concept of what they need, and not needing to be packaged in a module that kind of contains everything. And so, this new router would have optional modules. It would be component focused, and it would simplify the mental model of routing in Angular. So if any of you have worked in Angular long enough, you've probably run into some issues where, you've struggled with the router. I know it seems to be any time I need to add a new route, it can be difficult to figure out why it needs to be a child versus a sibling. And it makes sense, but it's easy to forget. And so going with more of a component-based router would look something similar to this, which would look familiar if you've come from more of a React background or worked with other front-end routers where, you've just got some kind of wrapping component that is going to insert whatever component is specified on the for that given route. So the example here would be if someone goes to the about route, then in this place, the about component would be rendered. One benefit of this is you could have lazy loaded components, not just lazy loaded modules. So your applications could be broken up even further, keeping the bundle sizes even smaller, improving performance in that way. So an example of what a application built with this structure would look like would be something like this, where that load about component is just a function that would lazily load the component when it's requested. So that is all of the NGRX stuff out of the way. So we'll move on to mono repos now. It's kind of weird doing a lightning talk with just silence. I'm going to head over here real quick because I need to...
Yay! Woo, that was awesome.
I need to remember to breathe. All right.
Wait, did somebody say something? I just woke up.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to share my whole window now because, wait, that's not the right one. I need to share my whole desktop. Entire screen. There we go. Okay, so, because just as a little tease, there will be a live demo coming up, so you got that to look forward to. Did a little soon, so you can look at my presenter view. We'll just go without the presenter view instead. A little cowboy presentation. Mono repos. By a show of hands, you don't need to turn your webcam on, I'll just know. By a show of hands, how many people are familiar with the concept of a mono repo? Looks like some of you. For those of you who don't know mono repo, you may have picked up on the mono part of it and thought that maybe a mono repo has to do with monoliths, and monoliths are bad in some instances, so mono repos may be bad, but that's not actually the case. A mono repo has to do with, just the code repository, how it's structured, and less to do with how the actual application is deployed. So the idea behind a mono repo is you have one or more applications and libraries and everything all housed in a single repository. And so if you were to ask kind of what I think the main benefit of going with a mono repo approach is, it would be code sharing. So to give kind of a trivial example, let's say you're working at a company and you need to create some kind of shared library. Let's say a shared UI library, for example, because that's, I think, what everybody has experienced at least some point in their career. So you've got, a half a dozen different portals, and you'd like to be able to start reusing some common UI elements between them. So you've got a couple things you need to do to get that up and running. First thing is you're going to need a new Git repo because you got to house the code somewhere. And so do you have permission to create the new repo? Maybe you don't. Maybe you're going to need to reach out to another department to get that handled. The next thing is, where will this code be hosted? One option is a private NPM package, but that's going to require a NPM account. And in order to host private repositories or private packages, that's going to cost money. Do you have the budget approval to pay for that? Another option would be setting up an internal NPM repository, but you'll likely need IT's help for that. And how busy are they? It may take them quite a while to get that server set up, if they even can. But let's say it's already set up, or you've worked your way through all of that stuff, so it's finally set up. So now you've got your shared library up and running, but you want to add a new feature or make some slight modification to a thing. So you've made the change in the shared repository. How do you test it within an actual application that makes use of it? One thing you could do is use npm link in order to share the updated repo with just this one specific application. But if you're like me, you've never used npm link in your life, and this is the first time you've heard of it. So maybe you just build it locally and copy and paste the changes into the applications node modules folder. Or maybe you've made a change to your lib and you need to create a new tag. So now you've got to tell all the other teams to target the latest version. Or what if a new version of Angular comes out, but the different teams haven't updated yet? So which version should your shared library be targeting? Or what apps are currently using your lib? How would you know that? Or it just kind of keeps going to the point where you decide maybe this developer job isn't really what I want to do, and it's time to just move to Alaska and start a new career. So that's kind of where mono repos come in. They help with alleviating a lot of these problems that are just inherent with sharing code across an organization by housing all of your code in a single repository. And so what I'll be talking about specifically is NX. There's several other kind of tools and frameworks and things that help you manage mono repositories. But NX started out with an Angular focus, and that's the one that I'm most familiar with. So first of all, what is NX? It's a kind of a set of tools that make it easier to work within a mono repository. And this isn't some crazy idea that's like just getting started. They've existed for decades, and a lot of the biggest companies make use of them. Yeah, Google, I think it was something like 95% of all code at Google is housed in a single repository. But yeah, theirs is kind of insane, and they've had to make a lot of tooling to maintain something of that size and scale and complexity. Facebook makes use of them. Microsoft uses them. I'm pretty sure the entire .NET framework is all in a mono repository. And so, yeah, NX is just some tools that make it easier to manage some of the complexities of housing all of your code in one place. And then it also has first-class support for multiple front and back end technologies. At the moment, focused on more of the JavaScript, TypeScript side of things. So it currently supports Angular and React on the front end, as well as anything that can be built with Webpack. So you can kind of just create a standalone web application. And then on the back end, it has support for Nest and Express out of the box. And then it also provides things like TypeScript, linting, unit testing with Jest or Karma, end-to-end testing with Protractor and blanking on the name of the new one, so let's check my notes. Cypress. There we go. So yeah, that's just kind of a brief overview of what NX is, but rather than talk about it in kind of high-level terms, I figured I'd just show you an example application. So let's make it a little bit bigger just in case. We'll go there. So if any of you have worked in an Angular application before, in fact, let me turn my camera off for this so you don't see this the whole time. Yeah, so if any of you have worked in a Angular application before, this probably looks pretty similar to you, with the exception of maybe this libs folder. But you've got an NX JSON file instead of an Angular JSON file, but when you look at it, it's all going to be very similar as far as kind of the contents inside of it. But you've got, yeah, your linting, your tsconfig. Oh, here we go, Angular JSON, found you. Yeah, so this one should look more familiar. NX JSON, we'll get to in a second. Yeah, so you've got your apps folder, and it's got your end-to-end as well as one of your applications. And so, yeah, this is all going to look similar to what the CLI has. And in fact, the CLI since version 7 or 8 has had support for mono repositories. So you could house all of your applications, all of your Angular applications in a singular repository just using the CLI. But NX provides some additional tooling and some slight changes. So yeah, the way the CLI would structure things is you would have the first application that gets developed goes in the app folder, and anything else goes in a project folder, which could contain both applications and libs. NX breaks it up a little bit different between the apps folder and the libs folder. And so if we take a look at this application, you can see that at the moment, it just lazy loads a feature module and has a home component. So NX is built on top of the CLI, so all of the CLI commands that you're used to still work here. So we'll serve up this demo app so you can kind of see what it looks like. And here you go on the lazy loaded route, and that works, and on the home route, and that works. And so, like I had said, the real benefits of a mono repository come into play when you're working with shared code. So let's say we wanted to create that shared UI library. So we can come in here, generate a new library. We'll call it UI. We'll put it in a directory of shared, just to make it explicit. And start with that. So it'll ask some questions. We'll use Sass for this, and it's done. So now if we look, we've got this shared containing folder which inside has our UI library. And if we come in here, it's got a module. And so let's create, if we go back to our application, you can see there's no footer. So let's go ahead and create that. And so rather than memorizing a whole bunch of command line arguments, it also has a generator. So we'll generate a component, which we'll call footer, and we'll put it in the shared UI library, and we'll want it exported. Whoops, there we go. And so now if we head back to our code, you can see we've got our footer component. And if we go to our module, we can see it's been added to the exports array. And then our index just exports whatever the shared UI module exports. So let's make use of it. First thing we'll need to do is import that module so we can get access to it. Easy, and just reload. You generate new libraries in VS Code. It doesn't always detect them right away because it caches your files. Yeah, we'll just do it the long way. So import from, and one nice thing about doing it this way is you'll notice we're not doing .. / libs / shared / UI. It gives you a alias for it, so that it's just like as if it were an existing a external library. We're not able to access anything that index file doesn't export, so it's completely isolated. So we've got that module imported. Let's start the server up again. And if we come in here and add, what did we call it? No footer. Now we can see that our footer is in the application and it works. And so let's just commit all of these. So let's say later on down the road, you're working on your footer and you realize it should actually look more of a footer. Still got the nice live reload and everything. But now we've made a change to the footer. Now we need to test all of our applications and libraries to make sure that everything works the way it's supposed to. So how are you supposed to know what this change affects just by looking at it? The nice thing is you don't need to. That's some of the tooling that that NX provides. So if we run this command, you can see that this change affects the demo application. Or if you'd rather look at it a slightly different way, we can have it draw up a dependency graph. And so we can see that our demo application relies on the shared UI library, and this affects it. And if we pull in the lazy feature, we can see that this change doesn't affect the lazy feature. It only affects the things that are in red. So if you had kind of some kind of CI/CD system, it could just run npm run affected test. And you'll see that it's going to run the tests for the shared UI library and the demo library, but not our feature library. And our tests aren't passing because they weren't passing to begin with, but it didn't bother running any of the lazy loaded features. And so this may sound cool, but some of you may be thinking like, well, what's to stop anything from importing anything? Could I go into my lazy loaded feature module and import the app module? And the nice thing is, by default, you cannot, because it does not provide any of these aliases to get to an application. And what if you just tried to do it anyway, kind of the long way? It will also complain because it has some existing lint rules that say libraries have to be imported from some kind of aliased path if they're not doing a relative import within themselves. So that's why this import works, but this one doesn't. So if you're running any kind of lint before your builds, this will complain. But let's say you don't want your shared footer to rely on things inside of this lazy loaded component, because you want this to just maintain, to be unaware of anything else so that it can be easily reused across your different systems. It does have support for that. And so the way you would do things like that is by adding tags. So let's say we came in here and gave you a tag of shared and you a tag of feature. So that by itself doesn't actually do anything, but you can go into your linter, which my brain, there we go. And come down here, you can see NX has provided this lint rule. So you can come in here and start adding your own things that say source tag of shared. Only depend on libs of tags. So we can say it can only depend on other shared libraries. And let's say that something tagged with feature can only depend on things with shared. So since we're already at 101, let's just do a real quick lib generation. Give this one a tag of feature as well. So I just generated another lazy loaded module and had it automatically import it. So if we come down here, we've got this feature B now. And because I tagged it with shared, or sorry, since I tagged this with feature, we've got that existing lint rule in place that says that a feature module cannot depend on another feature module. So if we try to import from this guy, module, I'm going off script here, so I need to reload to get the updates to the lint. Or if we just run glint. Yeah, there we go. So now you can see we've set up some rules that that need to be enforced at an architectural level so that feature modules cannot depend on each other, because we want them to also be kind of isolated and not just allow everything in the application to talk to everything. So that was a bit of a whirlwind at the end. But that is, in a nutshell, monorepos with NX. So yeah, I guess it's already a little after 1, but does anybody have any questions for Brian or myself on any of the topics covered?
Micah, will your demo be available?
Yeah, I can push it up to GitHub.
Okay. That sounds good. Thanks.
Yep, I'll throw it in Slack. In fact, before yeah, looks like everybody here should have access to Slack. So yeah, any other questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, your NG builds, I know one of the selling points of the Angular 9 upgrade was this Ivy stuff supposed to be amazingly fast, and your NG builds are all of a sudden going to be way faster. We found that that wasn't the case in our project that we just upgraded from 8 to 9. Have you guys noticed a side-by-side performance increase with your NG builds on the latest?
Yeah, so where the main benefit is your production builds. So ahead of time compilation got faster. Is that what you were saying was slower, or just like your NG serve?
Just our regular NG builds that aren't prod tend to be about the same. I was wondering if you guys noticed much of an increase there with the newer version.
Yeah, so where they were able to make ahead of time compilation, which runs by default if you do a prod build, they were able to make that faster. And so by doing that, they've removed just-in-time compilation entirely. So if you do an ng serve or a non-prod build, it's still doing the ahead of time compilation steps. And so if you're just seeing about the same performance, that would be considered a win because it's doing the more, it's doing the more intensive build process of doing some of the tree shaking and setting up doing more of the type checks that would normally only happen during prod. So if you ever had those instances where your template, you're able to build and serve fine locally, but when you tried to deploy it to prod, it would start throwing errors saying that it doesn't know about certain properties or functions. That's because of the just-in-time, ahead-of-time issues. So yeah, in that regard, it was less. Yeah, so the goal there was to get ahead of time to be the default to get rid of some of those issues. But then the other benefit is smaller bundle sizes. And so the smaller bundle sizes also have a caveat of the size of your application. So if you have a tiny application, a lot of the Angular core functionality is able to be tree shaken away. So the Angular core bundle itself is a lot smaller. On a large application, it's able to make use of a lot of the optimizations in how components reuse code. So each component requires less and less code. So if you have, dozens or hundreds of components, you'll get a big savings there. If you have more of a middle-sized application with, a couple dozen components, making use of most of the features in Angular, you're not going to see a dramatic decrease in file size because it kind of all washes out where your components are a little bit smaller, but you're using most of the framework, so it's not able to tree shake as much. So in that space, they were only seeing like a 2 to 3% file size reduction on average. So that was a bit of a tangent off of your question, but.
No, that's good to know. Thanks.
Yep. But yeah, that was one thing, like in the lead up to the Ivy release, they had really high expectations for kind of the potentials, and a lot of them haven't been fully realized yet, or they have been, but now there's more caveats. But they're still working towards a lot of those same goals of getting like one is getting a Hello World application in Angular to compile under 10K in size. They basically, once they started diving into it, they just found that things were kind of coupled in ways that made some of the tree shaking more difficult than they expected. So you're not alone in having of your expectations not meeting what was delivered with Angular 9.
Yeah, I know our DevOps guys are particularly frowning upon Angular in their builds because everything like we have a Microsoft stack or C# builds, everything else go fine. Then we get to the client tests and the client builds, and we're talking 7-8 minutes.
Yep.
That was before and after the Angular 9 upgrade, so we didn't notice a whole lot of increase. We didn't notice a decrease, which was good, but
yeah. And one of the if you're doing a fresh npm install each time, you're probably seeing an increase there too, because in order to ensure Ivy compatibility from the get-go, there's a post-install hook that recompiles any Angular-specific libraries to ES 2015 bundle, I think, or an ESM, I can't remember which, but to a different bundle type. And so that slows down an npm install a bit. So that could be another place you're seeing it.
Cool, thanks.
Yep. Any other questions? Awesome. Well then, I guess at this point, if you didn't already eat lunch, I'd say now's a good time for lunch.
Thanks, Micah and Brian.
Thanks, Micah.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.